I first knew Karen Davenport had set her sights on the Maplewood Community Garden when I heard her signature scoff behind me. I was kneeling in the soil, carefully tying back a row of tomato plants, when her high-pitched, nasal voice cut through the peaceful morning air. "This is getting out of hand, Sarah." I sighed before turning around. Karen stood at the garden's edge, arms crossed, her manicured fingers tapping against her forearm, the universal sign that she was about to launch into a complaint disguised as concern. I forced a smile. "Good morning, Karen." She wrinkled her nose. "Morning. Or at least it would be, if I didn't have to stare at this mess every time I walked outside." I glanced around. The garden was thriving, vibrant green vines, colorful rows of carrots, onions, and kale, and a group of neighborhood volunteers tending to their beds. It was beautiful. Karen, however, looked like she had just stepped into a garbage dump. "This is a neighborhood," she continued, "not a farmer's market. These plots are unsightly." I set down my gardening shears. "The HOA approved the garden 5 years ago, Karen. It's a designated community space." "That was before it started looking like this," she sniffed. "Overgrown weeds. Random people wandering in and out. It's a safety hazard. And property values, don't even get me started." I bit back my frustration. This garden helps people. Not everyone can afford fresh produce. "We donate food too." Karen waved me off. "People can buy food at the grocery store like everyone else." I clenched my jaw. Not everyone can afford that. "This garden supports low-income families and seniors." Karen scoffed. "I've already filed a formal complaint with the HOA. I expect this dump to be gone by next month." She turned on her heel and walked off, looking pleased with herself. I exhaled sharply. Karen had just declared war. And I wasn't going to let her win. Within a week, Karen had started an anti-garden campaign. She went door to door, clipboard in hand, collecting signatures for a petition to have the garden removed. Her reasoning? It was unsightly and hurt property values. It attracted pests and was a health hazard. It was being used by people who didn't even live in the neighborhood, a blatant lie. The worst part? Some people believed her. At the next HOA meeting, she presented her petition, 50 signatures scrawled across a sheet of paper, a smug smile plastered on her face. "We need to act now," she declared, "before this so-called garden turns into an infestation zone." A few HOA members nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. And just like that, Karen had momentum. I needed to stop her fast. If Karen thought I was going to roll over and let her bulldoze years of hard work, she was dead wrong. I started my own petition. Going door to door, I explained exactly why the garden mattered. It helped low-income families and seniors. It provided fresh vegetables for residents who couldn't drive. It was a pollinator haven, keeping the local ecosystem healthy. By the end of the week, I had triple the signatures Karen had. But Karen? She wasn't going down without a fight. The HOA meeting room was packed. Karen sat near the front, her petition clutched in her hands, her smug expression locked in place. I sat across from her, my own petition stacked beside me. The HOA president, David Walsh, sighed. "All right, we're here to discuss the community garden. Karen, you first." Karen stood immediately. "This garden is an absolute disgrace to our neighborhood," she declared. "It's ugly, attracts vermin, and lowers property values. It needs to go." Some residents murmured in agreement. Others looked unconvinced. Then it was my turn. I stood, keeping my voice calm but firm. "This garden has been here for 5 years, and it has never been a problem until now. It provides fresh food to dozens of families, promotes community engagement, and improves local biodiversity." I gestured to my petition. 3 times as many people want this garden to stay than want it gone. Karen rolled her eyes. "I don't care how many people sign that thing. The garden is a health hazard. That's why I've already contacted the county health department for an inspection." A ripple of unease went through the room. My stomach dropped. She had gone above the HOA. If the county deemed the garden unsafe, nothing would save it. I thought I had Karen cornered. But instead, she had just cornered me. 1 week later, the county health inspectors arrived. Karen stood proudly on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching as they walked through the garden. She was ready for them to shut it down. But then, something happened that she never expected. After an hour of careful inspection, the lead health official, Dr. Emily Carter, walked over. She smiled. "This is one of the best-maintained community gardens I've seen," she said. "Who's in charge of organizing it?" I raised my hand. "I am." Dr. Carter nodded approvingly. "I don't know what complaints were filed, but everything here is in compliance with county regulations. This garden is a perfect example of a successful urban agriculture initiative." Karen's smile vanished. But the rats. The sanitation problems." Dr. Carter frowned. "We found no evidence of vermin. In fact, community gardens like this help reduce urban food waste and promote food security." She reached into her bag and pulled out a document. "In fact," she continued, "I'd like to nominate this garden for inclusion in our county's Healthy Neighborhoods program. If approved, it will be eligible for funding and protection." I nearly burst out laughing. "Karen?" She looked like she was about to spontaneously combust. Within 2 weeks, the Maplewood Community Garden was officially backed by the County Health Department. That meant it couldn't be touched without county approval. It received funding for new tools and irrigation. It became a model for other neighborhoods. Karen had tried to destroy the garden. Instead, she had accidentally made it more powerful than ever. And her reputation? Destroyed. I had one. But something told me Karen wasn't done yet. For a brief, glorious moment, I thought Karen had finally given up. After all, she had suffered the worst defeat of her life, humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, rejected by the county health department, and exposed as the woman who tried to bulldoze a community food source. Most people would take the hint. Most people would let it go. But Karen Davenport? She wasn't most people. And when she came back, she wasn't just angry. She was out for blood. It started subtly. A few new HOA rules quietly slipped into the next monthly newsletter. All outdoor structures, including temporary plots, must be pre-approved by the HOA. No food distribution from residential properties without a proper permit. Aesthetic standards must be maintained for all public-facing properties. At first, it didn't seem obvious that this was about the garden. Until, of course, I got another HOA violation notice in my mailbox. I ripped it open, already bracing for the nonsense inside. Notice of infraction. Unauthorized public use of HOA property, community garden in violation of new HOA policies. Immediate compliance required. Fine. $2,000. I nearly laughed out loud. Karen had lost the battle. So now she was trying to win the war through paperwork. I grabbed my phone and called Mark Reynolds, my closest ally in the neighborhood. "Did you get the notice?" I asked. "Yep," he said. "Karen's trying to fine us out of existence." "She really doesn't learn, does she?" Mark sighed. "Nope." "So, what's the plan?" I smirked. "We fight back." Again. Karen thought she had us trapped. She thought she could rewrite the rules and fine the garden into oblivion. But here's what she didn't know. The community garden was technically protected by its new status under the County Health Department's Healthy Neighborhoods program. That meant it wasn't just an HOA issue anymore. It was a county-protected initiative. So I called Dr. Carter, the woman who had certified our garden in the first place. She picked up immediately. "Sarah, how's the garden holding up?" "Not great," I admitted. "The HOA is trying to shut us down with new bylaws and fines." Dr. Carter's voice hardened. "Oh, really? I'd love to see them try." She promised to send an official letter to the HOA, reminding them that the garden was legally recognized by the county. HOAs cannot override county health initiatives. Any further interference would result in legal consequences. The next day, I hand-delivered that letter to the HOA office. And Janet Holloway, the HOA's secretary, turned white as a ghost when she read it. "This is highly unusual," she stammered. I smiled. "No, Janet. What's highly unusual is a power-hungry HOA board trying to destroy a community food source. And just like that, the fines mysteriously disappeared. But Karen? She was furious. And I knew she was already planning her next move. I wasn't surprised when I got a motion alert from my security cameras at 2 a.m. Someone was sneaking into the garden. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the live feed. And there she was. Karen, wearing all black, crouching near the tomato beds, doing something. I narrowed my eyes. Then I saw it. A bottle. And she was dumping something into the soil. My stomach dropped. She was poisoning the plants. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone, called the police, and marched straight outside. By the time I reached the garden, Karen was still there, dumping whatever chemical she had brought with her. She didn't hear me until I flipped on my flashlight. She froze. "Going for a little late-night gardening session, Karen?" I asked, crossing my arms. Her face drained of color. I was just destroying the garden?" I finished for her. Before she could answer, the police pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, one of them holding a flashlight directly on Karen. "Ma'am, step away from the plants," one of them ordered. Karen whipped around, panic flashing in her eyes. "This is my neighborhood," she shrieked. "I have a right to be here." The officer gave her a deadpan look. "Ma'am, we just watched you pour a harmful substance onto public property. That's vandalism." Karen's mouth opened, closed, opened again. But she had nothing left to say. They arrested her on the spot. And for the first time ever, Karen didn't look smug. She looked defeated. The news spread through Maplewood Estates like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew. Karen had been caught trespassing and sabotaging a protected community garden. And the consequences were brutal. She was removed from the HOA board permanently. She was fined $10,000 for vandalizing a county-protected food initiative. She was publicly humiliated, her perfect suburban reputation in ruins. But the worst part for her? No one defended her. Even her former supporters avoided her, unwilling to be associated with the woman who tried to poison a garden. Within a month, Karen sold her house and left town. For good. Months later, the garden was thriving. With Karen gone, the HOA stopped interfering. The county's Healthy Neighborhoods program expanded, and we received funding for a new irrigation system, more raised beds for crops, a community greenhouse. One afternoon, I sat on a bench near the garden, watching as volunteers harvested fresh produce. Mark walked up, smirking. "So, do you think Karen ever recovered from that?" I laughed. "Doubt it." For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No more petty complaints. No more sabotage. Just a garden that had survived it all. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin. Karen had tried everything to destroy the garden. But in the end, the garden won. Karen was gone. The garden was thriving. And for the first time since this war started, I thought I could finally relax. But Maplewood Estates had a way of breeding new problems. And just when I thought everything was settled, I received a letter in the mail. One that made my stomach drop. Because even though Karen was gone, someone new was about to step up. And this time, they weren't just after the garden. They were after me. I found the envelope in my mailbox 3 weeks after Karen left town. No return address. No markings. Just my name, Sarah Whitmore, typed in cold, professional lettering. I tore it open and unfolded the letter. Notice of Community Review. Dear Ms. Whitmore, this letter serves as an official notification that your ongoing activities related to the Maplewood Community Garden will be subject to review by the newly appointed Homeowners Association President. In accordance with revised HOA policies, all public use spaces will be reassessed for compliance with community guidelines. A formal review hearing will take place on Friday at 7 p.m. Your attendance is strongly encouraged. Failure to comply with HOA policies may result in revocation of community privileges, property reassessment, or further legal action. Sincerely, the Office of the HOA President. I read the letter twice, my fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. The newly appointed HOA president? Karen was gone. But someone had already stepped in to take her place. And judging by this thinly veiled threat, they weren't just looking to clean up the HOA. They were looking to finish what Karen started. And this time, I had no idea who I was up against. Mark Reynolds was waiting for me on the front porch when I walked back inside, the letter still clenched in my hand. He raised an eyebrow. Bad news. I handed it to him. He skimmed it, his face darkening. Well, that didn't take long. Did you know they already replaced Karen? I asked. Mark sighed. Yeah. Some guy named Richard Calloway. Moved in last year. Kept a low profile until now. Great, I muttered. What's his deal? Ex-corporate lawyer, Mark said. Real estate background. Doesn't talk much, but from what I've heard, he's all about order and discipline. I exhaled. A lawyer. That explained the intimidating legal language in the letter. He's coming for the garden, I said. Mark nodded. And he's not going to make the same mistakes Karen did. This guy plays it by the book. I clenched my jaw. Karen had been messy, impulsive, and emotional. That's why she lost. But Richard? He was calculated. And that made him dangerous. By the time I arrived at the HOA hearing on Friday, the meeting room was packed. The air was tense, neighbors murmuring in hushed voices. At the front of the room, sitting behind the HOA desk, was Richard Calloway. Late 40s. Silver-streaked hair. Expensive suit. Cold, unreadable eyes. The type of man who could see you into the ground without breaking a sweat. Karen had been a blunt hammer. Richard? He was a scalpel. I took a deep breath and sat down. The meeting began. Richard cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. As the newly appointed president of the HOA, my first order of business is ensuring that all community projects adhere to proper guidelines. I folded my arms. The garden already does. Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's debatable. My stomach tightened. He opened a folder and pulled out a stack of papers. The Maplewood Community Garden was established under previous HOA leadership, he said smoothly. However, I've reviewed the documentation and there are inconsistencies. I narrowed my eyes. What inconsistencies? Richard tapped the folder. For starters, the original approval documents for the garden, they were signed off by an unauthorized board member. A murmur spread through the room. I frowned. That's not possible. He slid a copy of the document across the table. And there it was. The signature approving the garden's creation? It wasn't from the former HOA president. It was from a junior board member who had resigned 3 months later. Richard sat back. Which means that, legally speaking, this garden was never officially sanctioned by the HOA. I gripped the table. This was bad. If the garden had never been properly approved, Richard could technically void its existence. And that wasn't all. Richard wasn't done. Richard flipped to another document. And then there's this. I barely had time to react before he continued. In the HOA's governing rules, there's a clause under land use regulations that states, no property within Maplewood Estates shall be used for commercial agricultural activity without explicit board approval. I stiffened. This was a trap. A setup. That doesn't apply, I said, keeping my voice calm. This isn't commercial agriculture. We don't sell anything. The food is free. Richard's smile grew wider. But, he said, you do accept donations, correct? My breath hitched. I glanced at Mark. He looked just as tense. We did accept small community donations, nothing major, just a few neighbors chipping in for seeds, soil, or repairs. But Richard was spinning it into something bigger. Under HOA bylaws, Richard continued, any exchange of money, even donations, could be classified as commercial activity. I gritted my teeth. Richard leaned forward. So, under these terms, the Maplewood Community Garden is operating illegally. And just like that, he had found his loophole. I refused to lose. Not to Karen. And definitely not to Richard. So after the meeting, I did what I do best. I fought back. First, I met with Dr. Carter from the county health department. We're going to need to get ahead of this, I told her. She nodded. I can file an emergency motion with the county. If we reclassify the garden as an official food security initiative, It overrides HOA land use rules. I exhaled. Do it. Next, I called Megan Thompson, the local reporter who had covered Karen's downfall. You're gonna want to hear this, I told her. By Monday morning, the HOA's legal attack on the community garden was front-page news. HOA declares war on neighborhood garden. Again. The community erupted. People were furious. And by the time Friday's follow-up hearing rolled around, Richard was backpedaling. Fast. At the next HOA meeting, Dr. Carter arrived with a county order. The Maplewood Community Garden is now recognized as a county-backed food security initiative, she announced. Richard's jaw tightened. In short, she continued, your HOA has no jurisdiction here. The room burst into cheers. And Richard Calloway? He looked like he had just swallowed glass. And just like that, the garden won. Again. The garden had won again. Richard Calloway had been humiliated, his legal maneuvering crushed under the weight of county protection and public backlash. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe. I thought we were finally safe. But then, a black luxury SUV pulled up in front of my house. A man in an expensive charcoal suit stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he walked toward me. I narrowed my eyes. This wasn't an HOA officer. This was something worse. Ms. Whitmore, he asked smoothly, extending a business card. I took it, my stomach tightening as I read the name. Gregory Langston, Regional Development Director. Crestwood Property Group. I looked up. What do you want? He smiled, the kind of polished, rehearsed smile that only real estate executives and politicians could pull off. I'd like to make you an offer, he said. And that's when I knew. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. Gregory Langston didn't waste time. Your community garden sits on prime real estate, he began, gesturing toward the lot. Crestwood Property Group is interested in revitalizing Maplewood estates, bringing in modern amenities, high-value properties, and retail opportunities. I crossed my arms. Meaning? He smiled. Meaning, we want to buy the land. I scoffed. Not for sale. His smile didn't fade. Oh, I think you'll reconsider. We're prepared to offer $500,000 to the HOA in exchange for full redevelopment rights. My heart slammed against my ribs. $500,000. For a neighborhood like ours, that was a fortune. And worse? I could already picture certain greedy HOA members seeing dollar signs in their eyes. Langston could tell I was thinking it over. So he leaned in, dropping his voice. You fought hard for this garden, Ms. Whitmore, he said. But money? Money speaks louder than principles. I met his gaze. Not to me. Then I turned and walked away. But something told me. Langston wasn't the type to take no for an answer. 2 days later, I received a meeting notice in my email. The subject line made my stomach churn. Proposal review, Crestwood Development Plan. I knew exactly what this was. The HOA was entertaining Langston's offer. I showed up at the meeting, dreading what I already knew I'd hear. The usual suspects, Janet Holloway, a few other board members, were practically drooling over the money. $500,000 is a lot, Janet gushed. We could renovate the clubhouse, install new sidewalks, even repave the roads. Mark and Linda sat beside me, both tense. This is a bribe, Mark muttered under his breath. Richard Calloway, of course, was sitting at the head of the table, calm, collected. This is an opportunity, he corrected smoothly. The garden is a lovely concept, but let's be realistic, it benefits only a small portion of the community. This money? It benefits everyone. I gritted my teeth. By bulldozing a public food source? The county already ruled in our favor. Richard steepled his fingers. That doesn't mean we can't explore our options. And that's when I realized. This was never about the HOA's decision. The decision had already been made. They had sided with Langston. And if I didn't stop them, the garden was as good as gone. I stormed out of that meeting, heart pounding. Okay, Linda said, catching up with me. We need a plan. Fast. I exhaled. We go to the people. So that's exactly what we did. That week we organized community meetings to rally support. Called the county again, pushing for stronger protections. reached out to local news stations, exposing Crestwood's shady redevelopment tactics. And most importantly, we went door to door, making sure every single homeowner knew what was happening. It worked. By the next HOA meeting, over 200 residents showed up. Not just gardeners. Not just seniors. Families. Homeowners. People who never cared about HOA drama before. And when Richard and Langston tried to pitch the deal, they were met with outrage. "How dare you try to sell us out?" one woman shouted. "You can't erase our community just because some developer waved a check at you. This isn't about the garden. It's about power and greed." The HOA board members squirmed in their seats. For once, they weren't in control. And Langston? For the first time ever? He looked worried. Richard, of course, tried to spin it. "This is simply a discussion," he said, over the chorus of angry homeowners. "Nothing is final yet." "Then put it to a vote," I said. The room went silent. I stepped forward, gripping the edges of the podium. "If you really think this is best for Maplewood Estates, then let's settle it right here. Right now." Richard's jaw clenched. I turned to the crowd. "Who wants the garden to stay?" I asked. Hands shot up. Dozens. Then hundreds. Richard's expression darkened. Because he knew. He lost. The vote was called. And the results? Overwhelmingly against the buyout. The garden was safe. Crestwood's deal was dead. And Richard Calloway? He had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Within a week, the fallout was brutal. The HOA board members who backed Crestwood were forced to resign. Richard Calloway? He stepped down as HOA president, his reputation destroyed. Crestwood Property Group? Pulled out completely. And the best part? The county granted the garden permanent protection, ensuring that no HOA or developer could ever touch it again. The war was over. For good. Months later, I sat in the garden, watching the sun set over the rows of thriving crops. Mark handed me a cold drink. "Think this is finally the end?" I took a deep breath. "Yeah," I said, smiling. "I think we finally won. No more HOA corruption. No more legal battles. Just a garden that stood the test of time." And as I watched families pick vegetables, kids laughing, neighbors smiling, I knew we had done something worth fighting for. The first sign of trouble came in a thick envelope delivered straight to my door. Not from the HOA. Not from Crestwood. From a law firm. I stared at the return address. Henderson and Banks, LLP. Never heard of them. I ripped it open, unfolded the legal documents, and felt my stomach drop. It was a lawsuit. Filed against me personally. The charges? Interference with property development. Unlawful restriction of HOA governance. Defamation resulting in financial loss. My blood ran cold. Because the plaintiff wasn't Richard Calloway. It was Crestwood Property Group. And they weren't just trying to buy the garden anymore. They were trying to destroy me. I drove straight to Mark Reynolds' house, the lawsuit papers clenched in my fist. He skimmed them quickly, then looked up. "Jesus." "Yeah," I muttered. Linda, who had been listening from the kitchen, walked over. "What's the damage?" Mark sighed. "Crestwood is suing Sarah for $5 million. Linda's mouth fell open. "5? Are you kidding me?" I sank into the couch. "Nope." Mark ran a hand over his face. "Okay, this is not just about the garden anymore. Crestwood wants to make an example out of you. If they win, they can use this case to scare any other neighborhood that tries to fight back." Linda folded her arms. "Can they even do this legally?" Mark exhaled. "Big corporations? They don't need to be right. They just need to bury you in legal fees until you can't fight anymore." A pit formed in my stomach. I didn't have that kind of money. And Crestwood knew it. Which meant I had two options. Settle and let them win. Fight and risk everything. But there was one thing they didn't know about me. I don't back down. I needed an attorney fast. But not just any lawyer. I needed someone who could go toe-to-toe with Crestwood's corporate machine. Enter Evelyn Carter. High-powered, cutthroat, and one of the best property rights attorneys in the state. I found her through a contact at the county, and when I explained the situation, she didn't hesitate. "I'll take the case," she said. "But you should know, this won't be easy. Crestwood is playing hardball. They don't want your money. They want to crush you. I swallowed hard. Then let's make sure they don't. Evelyn smirked. I like you already. If Crestwood thought they could silence me, they grossly underestimated my ability to cause a scene. Because the first thing I did? I went to the press. I sat down for an exclusive interview with Megan Thompson, the same reporter who had covered the original HOA battle. The headline went viral within hours. Billion-dollar developer sues local woman over community garden. By the next morning, it was everywhere. TV segments, opinion pieces, social media outrage. Crestwood wanted a quiet legal victory. Instead, they had a public relations nightmare. The case went to trial 6 months later. Crestwood's lawyers came in confident. They had money, power, and influence. But what they didn't have? The truth. Evelyn tore them apart piece by piece. She proved the garden was legally protected. She exposed Crestwood's pattern of using lawsuits to intimidate small communities. She revealed documents showing Crestwood had tried to bribe HOA officials before the lawsuit was ever filed. The final blow? A whistleblower, a former Crestwood employee, testified that the lawsuit was never about damages. It was a scare tactic, a way to bully small communities into submission. By the time Evelyn finished her closing argument, Crestwood's lead attorney looked ready to vomit. The judge didn't even need a full day to decide. Verdict? Case dismissed. And Crestwood? They were ordered to pay my legal fees. The fallout was devastating for Crestwood. Multiple lawsuits from other communities followed. Their stock price plummeted after public backlash. And the CEO stepped down amid the scandal. As for Maplewood Estates, the HOA was restructured. The garden received permanent protection. And a new rule was passed: no HOA can accept outside corporate money. Crestwood had tried to destroy me. Instead, they destroyed themselves. 1 year later, I stood in the garden, watching the sunset. Mark walked up beside me. Think this is finally over? I smiled. Yeah. This time? I really do. No more HOA corruption. No more corporate threats. Just a garden that survived it all. And as I watched families picking vegetables, neighbors laughing, kids running through the rows of flowers, I knew we had done something worth fighting for. I thought Crestwood's defeat was the end. The lawsuit was dismissed. The HOA was restructured. The garden was finally safe. But then, a new real estate company started buying up houses in Maplewood Estates. At first, it was just 1 or 2 properties. Then 5. Then 10. And before I knew it, a third of the neighborhood was under new ownership. The worst part? No one knew who was behind it. Mark and I sat in his living room, scanning through recent property sales records. Every single one had been purchased by a shell company, Evergreen Development LLC. No CEO name, no listed investors, just a faceless corporation swallowing up our neighborhood. This isn't normal, I muttered. Mark frowned. It's a hostile takeover. Someone is buying up homes quietly, strategically. I exhaled. We need to find out who. It got worse. Neighbors started disappearing. Some left willingly, lured by above-market offers. Others? They were forced out, hit with random violations, aggressive buyout attempts, even legal threats. And the homes that were sold? They weren't being lived in. Oh, they had lights on, cars in the driveways. But the people? Never outside. Never talking. It was like ghost houses, designed to make the neighborhood look occupied when it wasn't. And then, one night, I saw it with my own eyes. A moving truck pulled up to a recently purchased home. A family got out, parents, 2 kids, all perfectly dressed. They smiled, waved, unloaded exactly 3 boxes. Then, they left, and never came back. That's when I realized. These weren't real homeowners. This was a staged takeover. But by who? I got my answer 2 weeks later. A neighborhood-wide letter arrived. An invitation to a Maplewood Estates future planning meeting. And the host? Richard Calloway. My blood turned to ice. Richard, the ex-HOA president who had tried to sell the garden. The same man who had resigned in disgrace. He was back. And I had a feeling. He wasn't here to make peace. The community center was packed. Richard stood at the front, looking as smug as ever, flanked by two suit-clad executives. The moment he started talking, I knew exactly what was happening. This neighborhood, he began, is in desperate need of modernization. He gestured to a projected map of Maplewood Estates. Half of it was shaded in red, including the land where the community garden sat. We are proud to announce that Evergreen Development is leading the effort to revitalize this area. Our goal? Transform Maplewood into a premier residential destination. Linda leaned over and whispered, translation, they're bulldozing everything. I folded my arms. Like hell they are. Richard smiled at me. I see we have Ms. Whitmore in the audience. You've been quite the activist, haven't you? I gritted my teeth. And you've been quite the snake. A few people snickered. But Richard didn't flinch. Instead, he dropped the bombshell. We have already secured 40% of the neighborhood. Within 6 months, we expect to reach 60%, at which point, per HOA rules, we can vote to rezone the entire community. The room fell silent. Mark whispered, if they hit 60%, they can override all existing protections. Even the garden. I clenched my fists. Richard looked directly at me. Like I said, Sarah, he murmured. It's just business. We had one chance. If Richard hit 60% ownership, the HOA would be legally allowed to rewrite neighborhood zoning laws. That meant the garden would be demolished. Remaining homeowners would be forced to sell. The entire community would become a luxury development. We had to stop him. We had to keep at least 40% of the neighborhood in local hands. The problem? Richard was offering people ridiculous amounts of money. And for some families, that kind of money was life-changing. We needed a counteroffer. Something that would make people stay. And we needed it fast. Just when things seemed hopeless, I got a call. It was Dr. Carter from the county health department. I saw the news about Evergreen Development, she said. And I have an idea. I sat up. I'm listening. What if we turned the Maplewood Community Garden into a permanent public land trust? I blinked. A what? A protected green space, she explained. If we get it state recognized, it becomes untouchable. No HOA. No developer. No corporate takeover. I grinned. How fast can we do it? Dr. Carter hesitated. It's a long process. But if we get enough homeowners to sign on, we can file an emergency petition to freeze development while it's reviewed. My heart raced. A legal loophole. The one thing Richard wasn't expecting. I exhaled. Then let's get to work. For the next 3 weeks, we fought harder than ever. We held town halls, explaining the land trust plan to homeowners. We knocked on every single door, convincing people to refuse Richard's offers. We launched a fundraising campaign, showing that the community wasn't backing down. And then, with only 3 days left, we hit the magic number. 41% homeowner support. Enough to block Richard's takeover. I stood outside the community center that night, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But Richard? He wasn't done yet. And I knew. His final move was coming. I woke up to another legal notice in my mailbox. This time, it wasn't just a letter. It was a court summons. Richard Calloway had officially filed an emergency injunction against the Maplewood Community Garden, claiming the land trust petition was fraudulent. The garden was blocking economic progress. Homeowners who refused to sell were being misled. In short, he was trying to kill the land trust before it could take effect. If he won, the freeze would be lifted. He could resume buying houses, and within weeks, he'd hit the 60% he needed. I clenched my jaw. This was it. The final battle. The hearing was set for Friday morning. Mark, Linda, and I sat in the courtroom, watching as Richard's high-powered attorneys filed in, smug and ready for war. But we weren't alone. Dr. Carter was there. Megan Thompson, the reporter, was taking notes. Even a few homeowners who had refused to sell sat in the back, watching closely. Richard himself sat at the front, wearing his usual calculated smirk. The judge entered. The case began. Richard's lawyer stood first. Your Honor, This so-called land trust is an illegal attempt to manipulate property values and block fair market transactions. It's designed to freeze progress and deny homeowners the right to sell at competitive rates. The judge turned to us. Ms. Whitmore, your response? Evelyn Carter, my lawyer, stood up. Your Honor, the land trust is completely legal. It is a recognized mechanism for community preservation, especially when developers attempt to force out long-term residents. She handed over a stack of evidence. Documentation proving our petition was valid. Records of Crestwood's prior HOA bribes. Testimonies from homeowners stating they were being pressured to sell. Richard's lawyer tried to object. But Evelyn? She tore him apart. By the time she finished, even the judge looked annoyed at how flimsy Richard's case was. Then, finally, the ruling came. The injunction was denied. The land trust was officially locked in. The community was protected. And Richard? For the first time ever? He looked genuinely furious. I should have known he wouldn't go quietly. That night, around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. An alert from my security cameras. Someone was at the garden. I grabbed my phone and opened the live feed. And there he was. Richard. Dressed in black. A canister in his hand. I zoomed in. My blood ran cold. It was gasoline. I shot up from bed, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. By the time I raced to the garden, red and blue lights were already flashing. A police officer was pinning Richard to the ground, his hands cuffed behind his back. His face? A mix of rage and panic. You don't understand, he yelled. This place was doomed anyway. I stepped forward, arms crossed. Arson, Richard? I said. That's low. Even for you. He glared at me. This neighborhood could have been something great. And you, he shook his head, disgusted, you ruined it. I smiled. Nah, we saved it. The cops hauled him to his feet, stuffing him into the back of a squad car. The officer in charge turned to me. We got here just in time, he said. One spark and this place would have been gone. I exhaled. Thanks for stopping him. The officer nodded. Richard had tried everything. Legal loopholes. HOA manipulation. Intimidation. And when that all failed, he tried to burn it all down. And now? He was going to prison. Richard was charged with attempted arson, trespassing, criminal property damage, and since he was already on thin ice with the county over his shady HOA dealings, the judge threw the book at him. 5 years in prison. No fancy lawyers could save him now. By the time the news broke, Richard's real estate empire collapsed. Evergreen Development? Shut down. The remaining properties they owned? Seized and auctioned. The corporate takeover of Maplewood Estates was officially dead. And Richard Calloway? He was finally out of our lives. For good. Months later, the garden was bigger than ever. With the land trust secured, we received grants and funding to expand. New raised beds for vegetables. A small orchard planted for future generations. A community center for workshops and gardening classes. Mark, Linda, and I sat on a bench one evening, watching the sunset. You think this is finally over? Mark asked, smirking. I let out a long breath, taking in the sight of families picking vegetables, kids laughing, neighbors working together. Yeah, I said. This time? It really is. No more HOA corruption. No more corporate takeovers. Just a garden that stood the test of time. And as I dug my hands into the soil, feeling the warmth of the earth, I knew. We had won. And nothing would ever take this away again. I thought it was over. Richard was rotting in prison. Evergreen Development had collapsed. The garden was safe, finally protected by the land trust. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. But peace never lasts long in Maplewood Estates. And one night, as I was closing up the garden, I found something that made my stomach drop. A single white envelope tucked neatly under the greenhouse door. No name, no stamp. Just one typed note inside. You may have won the battle, but the war isn't over. Watch your back. My hands clenched around the paper, because I knew one thing for certain. Richard may have been gone, but someone new was stepping in to take his place. The next morning, I marched straight to Mark's house, slamming the note onto his kitchen counter. He read it twice, then muttered, "What the hell?" Linda, sipping coffee at the table, frowned. This has to be someone tied to Evergreen. Maybe a lawyer or an investor. I shook my head. No, it's someone local. Someone watching. Mark exhaled. You think it's the HOA again? I crossed my arms. I don't know, but I plan on finding out. That week, I noticed something odd. New HOA board members had been elected to replace the ones who resigned. And their first order of business? Reviewing all existing community projects, including, you guessed it, the garden. At the next meeting, I sat in the front row, arms folded, as the new HOA president stood at the podium. Her name was Madeline Hayes. Mid-40s, sharp brown eyes, and the coldest smile I had ever seen. A Karen 2.0, but more polished. More calculated. She cleared her throat. As we transition into new leadership, it is our duty to assess ongoing community projects to ensure they align with our vision for Maplewood Estates. I gritted my teeth. Here we go again. Madeline's plan was sneaky, far more than Karen or Richard's ever were. She didn't outright attack the garden. Instead, she proposed a beautification initiative. It sounded harmless. Until I read the fine print. All non-essential structures must be reviewed for aesthetic approval. Reallocation of underused land for better community benefit. A vote to introduce new HOA maintenance fees on public spaces. Mark scowled. They're trying to tax the garden into the ground. Linda muttered, or reclassify it as underused, and snatch the land back. I clenched my fists. Madeline's playing the long game. She's not trying to destroy the garden right away, she's setting up the pieces. But I wasn't about to let her win. While we fought Madeline's HOA power grab, something else was happening. More homes were being bought up. Even though Evergreen was dead, the purchases continued. And just like before, the houses weren't being lived in. Mark and I did some digging. What we found made my blood run cold. The new properties? They weren't owned by Evergreen anymore. They were owned by a brand new company, Horizon Community Investments. And guess who was listed as one of the top executives? Madeline Hayes. I stormed into the next HOA meeting, gripping a folder full of documents. When Madeline saw me, she smiled, like she had been waiting for this. I slapped the papers onto the table. You've been quietly buying up homes, Madeline. Just like Evergreen did. Care to explain why? She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, completely calm. Oh, Sarah, she said sweetly. You really should read the fine print. She slid a document across the table. I scanned it, and my stomach dropped. Horizon Community Investments wasn't just buying homes. They had filed an official request for rezoning. And the worst part? They were targeting the land trust. If their rezoning request was approved, the garden's legal protection would be wiped out. We weren't just fighting the HOA anymore. We were fighting a full-blown real estate takeover. I had 2 weeks before the zoning commission would review Madeline's request. 2 weeks to stop the rezoning, expose Horizon Community Investments, save the garden again. And this time, I knew Madeline wouldn't go down easy. She was smarter than Karen, more patient than Richard, and she had powerful investors backing her. I had to hit her where it hurt, and I knew exactly how. One night, I saw Madeline having a private meeting in the back of the community center with a man in a tailored suit. I recognized him immediately, a high-level city zoning official. And that's when I knew. She was bribing him. I pulled out my phone, and I started recording. At the next public meeting, the zoning commissioner was in attendance. He was ready to approve Horizon's request. Until I stood up and played the recording. The entire room went dead silent. On the tape, Madeline's voice was crystal clear. If we get this rezoning passed, I'll make sure your people get priority on our new contracts. The zoning commissioner's face drained of color. And just like that, the rezoning request was denied. Madeline Hayes had lost. After the meeting, the county launched a full investigation into Horizon Community Investments. Madeline? She resigned from the HOA within a week. Her investors? Pulled out. The homes Horizon had bought? Seized for fraud. And just like that, the real estate takeover collapsed. 1 year later, the garden was bigger than ever. The community had fought off 3 different attacks. Karen, Richard, Madeline. All of them tried to destroy us. And all of them failed. One evening, Mark, Linda, and I sat by the greenhouse, watching the sunset. "Think we're finally safe?" Mark asked. I smiled. "Yeah," I said. "This time, I really do." And as I looked around, at the thriving plants, the families picking vegetables, the kids laughing, I knew. This garden? For years, they tried to take it from us. First Karen, then Richard, then Madeline. Each one thought they could win. Each one underestimated us. But in the end, the garden stood strong. And now, Maplewood Estates was finally ours again. No more corrupt HOA presidents. No more shady real estate takeovers. No more legal battles over land that was never theirs to begin with. Just a community. A garden that fed its people. A neighborhood that refused to be bought. One evening, I stood by the tomato beds, the air thick with the scent of fresh soil and summer rain. Mark leaned on the fence beside me. "So, what now?" I smiled. "Now," I said, watching as the sun set over the rows of green, thriving plants. "Now we grow. And this time, no one would ever take this away again."